Genesis chapter 12. We're in this lesson series on resilience, living with resilience, and the simple concept of not letting life drive you down and keep you down, but by God's grace, being able to have the tools in your life to get up and to keep going. And there are some handouts, new handout for tonight. If you didn't get one on the way in, it's still there at the back. Feel free to grab that if it's a help to you. Lesson 2, the title there at the top is "The Journey is in the Reward, Overcoming the Unknown." So let's read together Genesis chapter 12. We're going to look at Abraham tonight, looking at different lessons of different people that had to learn resilience, because many of us have to learn the same skill set in our life, and Abraham is going to be the figure we start looking at together this evening. But Genesis chapter 12 and verse number 1. "Now the Lord had said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed." Let's pray together, ask for God's help tonight. God, thank you that we can be here. Thank you for your marvelous grace. And thank you for the work that you are doing in our lives even tonight. Lord, thank you for each and every person here. I pray you'd help us as we gather together around your word. You teach us and develop resilience in our life. And help us to be people who are not overcome by life, but by your grace are able to stand and to push forward. We thank you for the help that you are. Pray that you teach us here together tonight. In Jesus' precious name, amen. I want you to think of that concept there at the bottom of the headline, Overcoming the Unknown. And I want you to realize that Abraham's journey was when God asked him to leave the known and to deal with the unknown. You know, for all of us in life, one of the things we have to be resilient against is dealing with the unknowns of life. I wish I knew a lot more than I know. You ever felt that way before? Ever kind of wish, you wonder, maybe I wish I knew what the next month held or the next 6 months held? I wish I could lay out my life and maybe plan and be able to see things maybe in a little longer view than dealing with them sometimes with such surprise. It's interesting as you look back through the Oxford Language Dictionary, every year they release a word of the year. And when you go back to 2020, unprecedented was supposed to be the word of that year. And of course, we know with everything that was going on in the world, it seemed like that word became overused. Everything was unprecedented. This is unprecedented. And thing after thing became unprecedented. And Oxford Dictionary got so overwhelmed with so many different words that it wanted to use to kind of describe and summarize 2020 that they decided in an unprecedented move, yeah, I know, to go for more than one word. And this was the report. They entitled it, Words of an Unprecedented Year. You know, we don't always know what's coming, do we? Sometimes life does surprise us. Often it does surprise us. And sometimes when life gives us one of those unprecedented things, we don't know how to handle it. And sometimes living in a world of the unknown can be overwhelming. If I were to ask you tonight, let's think about it for a moment. What are some of the things that we get surprised by, or some of the unknowns of life that can really be difficult to process? Okay, as we're going through life, the things that maybe we don't know right now, that can trip people up, that can make people sometimes overcome with worry or struggle in such a way of not being able to deal with life. What are some things? Can you think of anything? What are some things that might overwhelm people? It might be something that, the unknown that sometimes we struggle through. All right, go ahead. All right, sudden accident or illness, something happened of that nature, yes? Okay, financial hits that we just didn't see coming. We expected our finances to work, this way, and they don't, yes? Okay, governmental intervention, what are people going to do? Are they going to do this or going to do that? What's going to happen? Nobody else in the room ever worry about the future? Ever wonder what's next? Ever wonder, what does God have for me? What is coming down the pipe? I think these are big questions that sometimes we deal with. What is my life going to be? Is it going to be what it is? Is it going to be something else? And some people deal with big questions. Will I get married? Will I be single? All of these things. Will I be at the same job forever? Will something change? All of these things we struggle with what? With not knowing. I think it's incredible when we notice what God asked of Abraham. He asked him to leave everything that he knew for everything he didn't know. He asked him, I want you to leave the place that you know, called Ur. I want you to leave the people that you know, his family. And I want you to leave, and I want you to go to a place that I will show you. Understand, God didn't even give him a destination. There is no specific place on the map. The journey is going from Ur to Canaan. Of course, we know that's where the eventual destination was. But for Abraham, God asked him very specifically, I want you to leave what you know, and I want you to live in the unknown. In seasons of life where we grapple with the unknown, where we're seeking God's will, where we're seeking the what's next of life, when sometimes we're struggling through maybe more questions and uncertainties than answers, sometimes the very terror and fear and uncertainty of those unknown moments can make people stop and do nothing. But here we find an example of a man who was asked of God to leave the known for the unknown and responded and obeyed in faith. And I would say that transition from leaving what he knew and obedience for what he didn't know was one of the life-changing moments of his life. Don't we wish sometimes we knew more? I mean, even if you knew this week some of the problems you might face, at least you could work on solving the problems before they came. At least if you knew what maybe financially you had to budget for, it might be a little bit easier to prepare for that roof or that vehicle that's going to break. But we live in a world of unknowns. We don't know what's going to happen politically. We don't know what next war will happen where one country proclaims war against another. We don't know what will happen with the financial markets. And I mean, people lose sleep and lose their life over all of these things. Why? Because we grapple in a world of uncertainty. We live in a world that is unknown. And if you go down that proverbial rabbit hole long enough, eventually it'll just wreck you trying to figure out what to do with all the unknowns of your life. And it can be something so filled with worry with our unknown circumstances that we can turn our lives in circles instead of stepping forward in faith. So Abraham is a man who faced unknown circumstances, and he held on to God's commands and God's promises. Abraham lived sometime around 1850 BC. And in the passages that we're reading, he was probably around 75 years old. And at this point in his life, he had no children. And over the next 25 years, he would travel somewhere around 1,000 miles in obedience to God's request before he would get to his destination. We're not talking about instant gratification. We're not talking about instant answers. We're talking about a life of seeking by wandering, by leaning on God's direction until he ever got to that eventual destination. We're going to throw a map up here for you. Hopefully it'll help you a little bit. When Abraham started, he was in the Ur of Chaldees, which is in modern-day southern Iraq. And you can see that kind of on the bottom right there of that map. And then through his life, as you see different stories, he traveled to Haran, which is modern-day Syria, right up at the top of that point. Then he passed through Canaan to Shechem, and then eventually they passed on to Hebron, and then down to the southern coast of Canaan. So all of this was part of the travels of Abraham. And as you read through the Bible, you see some of these stories. But it took a long time for him to get to that destination. And of course, we know so much as far as Abraham as the father of the Israelite nation, so much turmoil that is in that region of the world even today. But here's a man who stepped out and left what he knew for what he didn't know. I got another picture here for you I think that'll be interesting as well. This is called Abraham's Gate. I've seen this before. It's a really interesting thing. So this was a gate that was built in one of those cities that we mentioned where Abraham would have visited. This is in the modern city, or the ancient city, I should say, of Dan, in the region of Dan. And they believe this is a place where Abraham went through. But here, this gate, which is almost, you can just see etched in it, kind of the stone leftovers, almost the dirt leftovers of where the stones were. You can still see some of those things. But somewhere in the region is around 4,000 years old from that region. And it's amazing to witness, amazing to see, but they call it Abraham's Gate, believing that at one point Abraham very well may have made his way through that during his journeys. We're talking about a man who gave it all to follow God into the unknown. And there are very many moments in life where God asks us, on the basis of our relationship with Him, to walk by faith in the unknowns of life and have resilience on the basis of God's promises and not on our security. It's wonderful to be secure, isn't it? It's a wonderful feeling to know I've got the money in the bank, I've got who I want in my life, I've got everything figured out, I've got the job that I want, I've got security. And think of Abraham, he had that from what we can see in many ways, and God says, I want you to leave that for the unknown. And that became the mark of his life, that God, as he looked at him, and he looked at the reality of the faith that he aspired to and lived, that was the very basis of his relationship with God. We know this is essential. Romans 1, in your notes in verse 17, says, For therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith. As it is written, the just shall live by faith. This is the essence of our relationship with God. It is what begins the process, or at least it begins at the moment of salvation. But it is also beyond that, it becomes the very essence of our relationship with Him. So much so when the Bible, both in the Old Testament and the New, looks at Abraham's life, Genesis 15 and verse 6, it says, and he believed in the Lord, talking about Abraham. And he, talking about God, counted it to him for righteousness. So this was a big deal to God. When Abraham was willing to do what? To say, God, I will leave what I know, and I will go to what I do not know, and I'm going to trust you for it. God looked at that and saw the great faith that it took to live in insecurity and said, I am going to honor that. That's why Romans 4 and verse 3 says, for what saith the Scripture? Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him for righteousness. Now, as much as this initiates our relationship with God, it is also ongoing in our relationship with God. That's why 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 7, I think, is also in your notes. For we walk by faith, not by sight. It's so important to God. Hebrews 11 and verse 6 says, but without faith it is impossible to please Him. For he that cometh to God must believe that He is, and that He is a rewarder of them that diligently seek Him. Now, why are we spending time on this tonight? Why are we spending time about the necessity of living with God in the unknowns? Because it is often in our inner worries, in our inner turmoil, that sometimes our inability to stand begins. People struggle, as we've mentioned in the previous lessons, internally before they ever struggle externally. People filled with worry will sometimes do things in a hope to gain security that are so far outside of the will of God than you could ever imagine. We hate the feeling of being fragile. We hate the feeling of the unknown. Sometimes like a person wandering in the darkness, we're just clawing for something that will give us security. And here is God asking Abraham, and often asking the child of God, I want you to live in the unknown, and I want you to walk with me through the unknown. And see, so often in life when we try and grasp for security, we lose it. Sometimes when we seek after our own manufactured ways, like maybe Abraham could have said, you know what, God, I'm really good where I'm at. I like my family. I like my place. I like my work. I'm comfortable here. but he would have missed everything that God had for him, even in the unknowns and the lack of certainty. So what can we look at from Abraham's life to try and understand our own walk of faith as we face uncertainties? How can I deal with uncertainties so I don't be someone that's so filled with worry that they break me about what could be next or what could be the next terrible thing I deal with? But how can I respond in faith to be someone that trusts God, has a good relationship with Him through the uncertainties of life? First thing is this, number one, where we'll spend our time with, Lord willing, tonight. Number one is this: faith to follow. Faith to follow. What it basically means is Abraham's job was not to go to a destination, but to follow God's commands. You know, following sometimes isn't fun. I loved it when they invented GPS. It's a wonderful thing. Because before that, remember the days where someone would say, let's go to your house. And they'd say, follow me. And you knew it was going to happen at some point, right? I mean, with all the traffic lights in Hamilton or many other cities, that they're going to hit it and would say, all right, this is how you get to my house. And they'd give you a really long thing. And at the very end, when I was using GPS, I'd be like, can I just give me the address? I don't want to follow the directions. Just give me the address. Why? Because following is hard. It means totally and absolutely depending on the person that is in front of you to make decisions that is not going to wreck you. It means putting your confidence that someone else knows what they're doing better than you knowing what you're doing. And most of us would rather call our own shots, make our own directions, and get to our own destination in our own confidence than trust anybody else to give us a play-by-play or a word-by-word instruction. But know that God decides within the Christian life intentionally at times to keep us in obscurity. You understand that scripturally God could tell you everything that was going to happen in your life. He could work that way. But God intentionally at times just says, I want you to follow me. And we're going to look at some reasons possibly why as we get through our lesson tonight. But I do want you to understand that faith to live in the unknown and to follow God to whatever may be next is something that is essential to deal with the unknowns of life. If you have that faith, letter A, faith is exercised. Faith is exercised. That means there's no such thing as dormant faith. Faith is not inspirational by itself. That's not where faith ends. Faith is not just intellectual. It's not just in your mind. It's not something that is just trite to be written across a Christian card, but it is something that requires definite action. See what the Bible is saying? The Bible is laying out the fact that Abraham's faith was shown in his willingness to leave what he knew to go to what he didn't know. To leave a place of confidence and security to a place of insecurity. Look how verse number 4 in Genesis chapter 12. Genesis chapter 12, verse 4. How does Abraham respond? The next three words. So Abraham departed as the Lord had spoken unto him. I can just imagine how that conversation went with his wife, right? He came home. Hey, Sarah, God wants us to leave. We're leaving Ur. How long are we going to be gone? I think a while. Where are we going? No idea. But God says go, and He's going to show us. Well, do they speak the same language where we're going? Don't know. But we need to go. I am just assuming, knowing how life often works, that was a long conversation. What about my mom? What about our family? What about everything we've built here? What about our house? What about our lands? What about our property? Everything that they had. And Abraham is dealing with what? I can't answer all of these questions for you, but I am choosing to obey even when it's not known. Now look, this is how we act with God often. God, tell me what you want, and then I'll decide whether or not I want to do it. Right? God, lay it out for me, and then I'll make the call. God says, no, I want you to obey, sign your name on the dotted line, and say, I will go, I will do, I will obey, and then I'll show you. You know, some people never know the will of God, never follow the will of God, because they're waiting to say, God, I'm still in control. Once you tell me what you want, then I'll decide whether or not I want to obey. God says, no, I want you to live in the unknown. I want you to be willing, to be obedient, and we are going to move on past that. That was Abraham's test. That was his great struggle. Let me ask you this. I want you to think about this for a minute. Why, when it comes to obedience, do many people want to know first before they decide whether or not they're going to obey? Why is this a struggle for us? Why do people want to know first? Yes? What's that? Okay, we don't know the outcome. Sometimes we're very pragmatic. If I do what God asks, sometimes we're like, I can see it going wrong. And sometimes we do struggle that way. If I do what God has asked, it might go wrong in this way or that way. And sometimes we don't see how God's way works until we do it. What else? Why don't we struggle with this? Michael? Okay. Yes. And sometimes there's things we're maybe not feeling like we're ready to give up, right? It might be, well, God, there's certain things I want to do. I'm not sure I want to stop doing those things. And if I submit to you on everything, he'll probably ask for the one thing I don't want to give. And sometimes there's a struggle. Why else? Why else might be struggle to do so? Yes? Sure. Yeah, I guess depending on who you are. I mean, I'm with you. I'm a planner. I like to plan for everything I possibly can plan for. And so I love as much advance notice as I can get, because then I can, schedule my time, my finances, my life around it. We all know life doesn't always work that way, and God often doesn't work that way. God doesn't give us all the advanced information, but God does often do the exact same thing that he did to Abraham. I want you to venture with me to the unknown. I want you to give me your hand. I want you to be willing to obey. And I want you to follow me to a land that I will show you. And we're going to figure it out, you and I. But I just want you to be willing to go and willing to follow. And this entire thing became the very essence of Abraham's faith. It is why we look back in the Word of God, and God looks at Abraham as a man of faith, because his faith was not something that just was an idea that he stayed in Ur of the Chaldees with. No, faith was something that said, I'm going to do something because of the faith that resides in my heart. Understand today, faith must make you do something. If you say you have faith, as you're reminded on Sunday, works need to accompany. At some point, it has to be something that showcases itself, and hey, this is real in my life. That's why by the time you get to Hebrews 11, we see all these different people listed in this passage that is known as the Hall of Faith. And we see people that acted out on the basis of what internally occupied their heart. Verse 4, by faith Abel offered. Verse 5, by faith Enoch was translated. Verse 7, Noah prepared. Verse 8, the person we're looking at tonight, Abraham obeyed. His obedience rested on his faith. Verse 9, he sojourned. Verse 17, Abraham offered. His faith acted. And notice this, faith reveals self in action. And if we're going to say tonight, God, all right, I want to be resilient. God, I want to be able to handle all the different affairs of my life. I want to be able to handle the unknown. One of the first questions we have to ask ourselves is, am I willing to take a step of obedience in an area of my life that I do not know the outcome? Am I willing to say, God, I'm willing to trust you when I don't know where you're taking me, but I know what you're saying. I know what you're asking of. Because we struggle with pragmatism. We struggle with, like was mentioned tonight, I want to know how it's going to turn out. I want to know the results. I want to know the impact. I want to be able to put a pros and cons list together, God. I want to know, if I do what you said to do, what is this going to mean for my life? And God just says, I'm not telling you that. I want to know if you will follow me into the unknown. So here Abraham exercised his faith. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 says, trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not unto thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths. I'm running out of time, so I just want to take a couple moments on this verse and we'll be done. What are some of the ways that we, battle in our own reason to struggle against trusting God's promises? All right, God says, trust in me, and he says, don't lean on your own understanding. Can you think of any examples? What are some of the ways that God might ask us to obey, and some of the things that our reason or our minds might say otherwise? All right. Okay. Sure. But we still don't want anything awful to happen to us, and we know that it might. Right. Okay. We might remind ourselves when God says obey of all the consequences that could happen. I don't think of anything else. What are some of the things that might happen? Yes. Okay. Yeah. Scared of being alone. Say, God asks us to do something, and I might, have to do it all alone. What else? This is a very real part of the Christian life. This is why this is a precious verse they remember, and it's great for the example from Abraham. Yes? All right. If I try, I'll fail. Right? And that is one of the struggles. And sometimes we have failed in the past. And it's like, well, I probably shouldn't try again because I'll just fail again. Right? So we don't even bother to try. What else? Good for us to brainstorm together for a minute. I know one sometimes that I think through at different times or have thought through. If I do that, someone's going to be really mad. You ever thought that before? If I do what's right, someone at work's going to be mad. Someone in my family is going to be mad. For me, sometimes in dealing with relationships within a church family, I'm like, someone at church might be mad. It's hard. It's hard. And it's tough to sometimes weigh not just, is this what God says? Is this what's right? But it's tough not to think through what are the repercussions of that going to be and how many people might be angry, right? I don't think any of us enjoy those experiences. What else? Think of any other ones? Sometimes we think if I follow God, I know sometimes even when it comes to giving or different areas, I won't make it. I won't be able to eat. I won't be able to do this or do that. And I know for some people even, with dealing with ministry, that's a real big fear. How am I going to, make ends meet? How am I going to, take care of things? Anything else? Yes? Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's very true. Very true. Appreciate that. Yes? There's also the problem with doubt. Saying, is this really what God wants? Yeah. And sometimes we can really talk ourselves out of it. We know sometimes, and that's a battle for us, even within our own conscience. We're like, is this something I should, a movie I should watch, music I should listen to, is this a book I should be reading? And sometimes we try and analyze it, and you're right, sometimes God is legitimately telling us not to, and we talk ourselves out of it. Well, it's not really that bad, and sometimes we work our way through. And sometimes we are, just struggling with our conscience as to what is right and wrong. And that can be a real battle. Anybody else? If not, I'll close things up. But I just want you to think through this, because I want you to think for Abraham what that moment must have been like, where God said, leave the known, go to the unknown, to a place that I will show you. And can you imagine all the things reasonably that could have gone through Abraham's mind. What am I going to eat? I mean, that would have been like top of the list for me, right? We're hauling across the wilderness. I mean, I can take a certain amount of food, but that food is going to run out, right? And we're just going to keep going, and I'm going to kind of figure it out on the way. I mean, am I going to eat decent food, or am I going to be like surviving off grasshoppers and crickets, for the next distance? I mean, these are real challenges. How upset is, my wife's family going to be? These are all realities of life. And dealing with the unknowns of life can torment you and destroy you and break you on the inside if we can't, as people, develop faith and a willingness to follow God in the uncertainties and unknowns of our existence. And that's how we're looking at this. If we want resilience, we also have to develop faith. And I hope we'll be able to do that as we look at the story of Abraham together.